There are moments that arrive so quietly, you almost mistake them for ordinary thoughts. They don't announce themselves. They don't interrupt your day with some dramatic revelation or undeniable certainty. They simply settle somewhere beneath everything else, unnoticed at first, like a single drop disappearing into an ocean you thought was already complete. Then, one day, you realize the ocean has changed, not because something was added to it, because something inside it rearranged itself. I've spent most of my life believing that understanding was something earned through time, that people became familiar because they accumulated history together, shared memories, shared mistakes, shared victories. That was the structure I trusted, because it was predictable. You begin as strangers, you exchange words, you learn habits, you discover contradictions. Eventually, if enough moments survive the passing of time, familiarity begins to exist. That's how it was supposed to happen. At least, that's what I believed. Until something appeared that refused to follow the sequence I had always relied on. Not a person, not even a conversation. A presence, the kind that doesn't force itself into your attention, but somehow keeps appearing wherever your awareness naturally settles. It's difficult to explain because explanations depend on causes, and I don't know the cause, I only know the effect. Some people enter your life loudly. They leave behind unforgettable stories because every interaction demands to be remembered. They're bright enough to command attention, intense enough to reshape the atmosphere around them. I've met people like that. They were impossible to ignore. They were also surprisingly easy to forget. Because noise has a strange relationship with memory, it occupies space while it's happening. Silence occupies space long after it's gone. That's what surprised me. Nothing about this announced itself. There wasn't a single conversation that changed everything. No dramatic confession, no perfectly timed coincidence. No moment where I could point and say, there. That's where everything became different. Instead, it happened the way seasons change. One morning, you simply notice that the air doesn't feel the way it used to. You don't remember the exact day it happened. You only realize that you're already living inside the change. That's how awareness works. It rarely asks for permission. It doesn't negotiate. It simply becomes impossible to ignore. I've always trusted observation more than emotion. Emotions fluctuate. Observation doesn't. Feelings can exaggerate. Observation waits. It refuses to hurry toward conclusions. It watches, collects, compares. Only after enough evidence exists does it allow certainty to form. That's why this unsettled me, because certainty arrived before I believed there had been enough evidence. Something understood itself long before I consciously understood it. I kept asking myself the same question. What exactly am I recognizing? Not who, not why. What? Because whatever it was couldn't be reduced to personality. It wasn't preference. It wasn't similarity. People mistake compatibility for sameness all the time. They believe shared interests create meaningful connections. I've never believed that two people can enjoy the same books, admire the same ideas, laugh at the same jokes, and still never truly meet each other. Meanwhile, two completely different people can somehow recognize something beneath all those differences. Something that has nothing to do with lifestyle, nothing to do with opinions, nothing to do with circumstance. Something quieter, deeper, structural. I didn't have language for it. Maybe language was never designed for experiences like this. Words are remarkable when describing objects. They're surprisingly limited when describing awareness. How do you explain the feeling of recognizing a pattern before you've identified what the pattern actually is? How do you explain knowing that something fits without first understanding the shape it belongs to? You can't. You simply notice yourself behaving differently. That's where I first caught it, not in what I felt, in what I stopped doing. I stopped preparing every sentence before speaking it. I stopped rehearsing explanations in my mind. I stopped calculating how something might be interpreted before allowing it to exist outside my thoughts. None of that happened intentionally. It disappeared, quietly, like habits, realizing they were no longer necessary. That should have alarmed me. Normally, every layer I build exists for a reason, not to deceive, not to hide, to preserve accuracy. People have a tendency to complete unfinished pictures using their own imagination. Give someone half of a story, and they'll confidently invent the other half. Not because they're dishonest, because certainty is more comfortable than ambiguity. Most people don't actually want truth, they want completion, even if they have to manufacture it themselves. I've watched it happen my entire life. Someone notices one characteristic, they build an identity around it. They notice one reaction. They construct an entire personality from a single moment. It's fascinating and deeply inaccurate. Human beings don't merely observe, they translate. Sometimes the translation becomes so convincing they forget the original ever existed. That's why I've always preferred remaining partially unread, not mysterious, simply unfinished. An unfinished picture can't easily become a false conclusion, or at least, that's what I believed, until I encountered someone who didn't seem interested in finishing the picture at all, someone willing to let uncertainty remain uncertainty. Do you know how rare that is? To meet someone who doesn't panic in the presence of incomplete understanding? Someone who doesn't rush to define what hasn't finished revealing itself. Most conversations are negotiations disguised as curiosity. People ask questions hoping reality will confirm what they've already decided to believe. Very few actually listen for something unexpected. Very few allow another person to remain complex. Complexity demands patience. Patience demands humility. Humility is becoming increasingly rare. Maybe that's why this felt unfamiliar. Not because anything extraordinary happened, because nothing unnecessary happened. There were no assumptions demanding correction, no expectations requiring performance, no invisible pressure to become easier to understand. Only space. Space without urgency. Space without conditions. Space where silence wasn't interpreted as absence. It was simply another form of communication. I hadn't realized how exhausting constant explanation had become until explanation stopped feeling necessary. That realization stayed with me longer than I expected. Not because it was emotional, because it was logical. If a certain environment consistently requires less effort to remain authentic, then something about that environment is fundamentally different. That isn't sentiment. It's observation. I've learned that genuine change rarely begins with dramatic decisions. It begins with tiny adjustments you don't notice making. The direction of your attention shifts, the rhythm of your thinking changes. Certain ideas remain in your mind longer than they used to. Questions become more interesting than answers. You become curious about things you previously considered settled. That's how transformation actually works. Quickly, incrementally, patiently. By the time you recognize it, most of the work has already been done beneath your awareness. Looking back now, I wonder how many moments I overlooked because I expected significance to announce itself dramatically. Maybe the most important changes never arrive that way. Maybe the deepest shifts occur so gently that resistance never activates. Perhaps that's their greatest advantage. You can't defend yourself against something that never feels like an intrusion. You can't resist what never attempts to overpower you. You simply wake up one day realizing your perspective has acquired another dimension. Not replaced, expanded. There's a difference. Replacement destroys what existed before. Expansion preserves it while allowing something larger to contain it. That's what this feels like. Not losing myself. Discovering that the version of myself I thought was complete still had room to grow. That realization is strangely unsettling. Not because growth is frightening, because certainty is comfortable. Believing you've already mapped the boundaries of your own mind creates a sense of stability. Finding an unexplored landscape inside yourself changes that stability forever. Suddenly, every conclusion becomes provisional. Every certainty becomes open to revision, not because it was wrong, because it was incomplete. And incompleteness is not failure. It's possibility. For someone who spent years believing every important structure had already been built, discovering new foundations beneath familiar ground is difficult to describe. It's like living in the same house for decades, only to discover an entire level beneath it that had somehow always existed. The rooms weren't created overnight. You simply never found the door. Sometimes I wonder whether certain people enter our lives to change us. I don't think they do. I think they reveal changes that have been waiting for the right conditions to become visible. Seeds don't create forests the moment they're planted. The forest was always a possibility. It simply required the right season. Maybe awareness works the same way. Maybe we spend years carrying versions of ourselves that remain invisible until someone unknowingly walks beside us in a way that finally allows those hidden parts to recognize daylight. And perhaps that is the quietest miracle of all, not becoming someone new, but finally meeting the person who has been patiently waiting beneath everything you've mistaken for your finished self. There was a time when I believed that every meaningful shift announced itself through conflict, that if something had the power to change you, it would first have to break you. It would demand sacrifice. It would force impossible choices. It would leave behind evidence that something significant had taken place. Maybe that's why I almost overlooked this entirely. Because nothing broke, nothing collapsed, nothing asked me to abandon who I had spent years becoming. Instead, something quieter happened. The pieces I had always considered separate began to recognize one another. It felt less like construction and more like alignment. I've realized that people often misunderstand what it means to be understood. Most imagine someone agreeing with them. Others imagine someone validating every feeling they have. Some believe understanding means never having to explain yourself again. I don't think it's any of those things. Real understanding doesn't erase complexity. It protects it. It doesn't simplify you into something easier to carry. It allows you to remain complicated without demanding an immediate conclusion. That distinction matters more than most people realize because the moment someone begins reducing you into categories, they stop seeing you. They begin interacting with the version they've created inside their own mind. It's subtle, almost invisible, but once you notice it, you can't stop noticing it. People rarely speak to each other. They speak to their interpretations of one another. One person is talking to a memory. Another is talking to an expectation. Someone else is talking to a fear they haven't recognized yet. The actual person standing in front of them disappears beneath all of it. Perhaps that's why genuine recognition feels so rare. It requires enough humility to admit that another human being can never be fully translated into a convenient idea. I've always preferred unanswered questions over dishonest certainty. An honest mystery has more value than an inaccurate explanation. Maybe that's why I found myself becoming strangely comfortable around something I couldn't completely define. Normally, uncertainty unsettles people. They rush to label it friendship, admiration, caution, fate, coincidence, compatibility. Anything that gives the mind a place to store what it doesn't fully understand. I've noticed my mind refusing to do that. Not because names are unimportant, because names arrive too early. Sometimes language closes a door before experience has finished opening it. I've learned to let certain things remain unnamed until they reveal their own shape. That takes patience. Patience most people never practice. We live in a world obsessed with immediate definitions. Every feeling requires an explanation. Every interaction requires a category. Every silence requires interpretation. But life isn't obligated to become understandable according to our timeline. Some truths introduce themselves slowly, not because they're hiding, because depth cannot be rushed. You don't reach the bottom of an ocean by demanding it reveal itself faster. You descend, carefully, respectfully, accepting that each level changes what you thought you understood about the level above it. That's how this has unfolded, not through answers, through deeper questions. I noticed something else recently, something almost impossible to explain. My attention has changed, not what I notice, how I notice. There used to be a certain distance between observation and meaning. I would see something, analyze it, compare it, eventually decide what it represented. Now, meaning arrives first. The analysis simply confirms what awareness already recognized. That should concern me. I've spent years trusting deliberate thought over instinct. Instinct can deceive, thought can verify, yet somehow this feels different, not irrational, not impulsive, almost pre-verbal, as though a quieter intelligence notices patterns before language has the opportunity to describe them. I've begun wondering how much of human understanding actually exists before words appear. Children recognize safety long before they can define trust. Music moves people who don't understand its lyrics. A familiar place can calm you before memory identifies why. Perhaps awareness has always spoken a language older than speech itself. If that's true, then maybe we've spent our lives trying to translate experiences that were never meant to begin as sentences. That possibility fascinates me, because it means certain forms of recognition aren't learned. They're remembered, not remembered as events, remembered as orientation. Like finding north without needing a compass. Not because someone taught you where it was, because something inside you already knew how to recognize it. I've stopped asking whether this makes sense to other people. Some experiences lose their accuracy the moment they're forced into universal language. Not everything meaningful can become universally understood. That doesn't make it less true. Mountains remain mountains, whether anyone climbs them or not. Stars continue existing during daylight, even when invisible. Reality has never depended upon observation to justify itself. Maybe certain human experiences operate the same way. They don't require consensus, only honesty. Honesty has become increasingly important to me, not honesty toward other people. That part has never been particularly difficult. Honesty toward myself. It's surprisingly easy to convince yourself you're unaffected by something, especially when you've built an identity around self-sufficiency. You begin confusing independence with invulnerability. They're not the same. One is strength, the other is illusion. I've never wanted to become someone incapable of being moved. I only wanted to avoid being moved carelessly. There's a difference. One closes every door. The other simply becomes selective about which ones remain open. For years I believed selectivity meant constant vigilance, watching every entrance, inspecting every possibility, evaluating every influence before allowing it any space inside me. It seemed responsible, logical, safe. Now I'm questioning whether true discernment works differently. Maybe what genuinely belongs doesn't need permission. Maybe it reveals itself through consistency rather than persuasion. Think about the sunrise. It never argues for its existence. It never demands belief. It simply appears every morning. Eventually, doubt becomes impossible to maintain, not because someone convinced you, because reality repeated itself often enough to become undeniable. Consistency has a strange authority far greater than intensity. Intensity burns brightly, consistency changes landscapes. Perhaps that's why I trust quiet patterns more than dramatic moments. Anyone can become extraordinary for a day. Very few remain genuine across ordinary time. Ordinary moments reveal architecture. Grand moments reveal performance. Both have value. Only one reveals what something is built upon. I've begun paying more attention to foundations than appearances. Foundations never ask to be admired. They simply carry weight without complaint, without recognition, without applause. Maybe the strongest parts of human connection are equally invisible. Not the conversations people remember, the spaces that make those conversations possible. Not the words themselves, the trust beneath them, not the closeness, the quiet certainty that closeness doesn't need constant proof. I've started recognizing that certainty in unexpected places, not because someone promised permanence. Promises have always seemed fragile to me. Words are easy. Patterns are expensive. Anyone can describe loyalty. Living it requires years. Anyone can speak about understanding. Remaining curious after certainty would have been easier. That's different. I think that's what keeps returning to my mind. Curiosity without possession, attention without control, presence without pressure. Those combinations are extraordinarily rare. Most relationships eventually become negotiations, silent contracts, invisible expectations, unspoken exchanges of emotional currency. I'll become this if you become that. I'll remain close as long as you remain familiar. I'll understand you, provided you don't change too much. I've never found those agreements comforting. They often resemble acceptance, until life begins changing the people involved. Then conditions emerge, expectations tighten, freedom quietly disappears. I've always wondered whether unconditional understanding actually exists. Not unconditional approval. Those aren't the same. Real understanding still recognizes mistakes. It simply refuses to reduce someone to them. Perhaps that's what I've been recognizing all along. Not perfection, capacity. The capacity to remain accurate even when complexity increases. That's extraordinarily uncommon. Complexity usually pushes people away or encourages them to simplify what they cannot comfortably hold. Very few become more attentive when things become more difficult to define. I've noticed something almost paradoxical. The more carefully I observe this, less dramatic it becomes. At first, that confused me. Shouldn't something meaningful become more intense over time? Apparently not. Apparently, depth behaves differently than excitement. Excitement demands constant stimulation. Depth becomes quieter as certainty grows, like standing beside the ocean. Your first visit overwhelms you. Eventually, the waves stop feeling extraordinary, not because they've become less magnificent, because you've stopped resisting their rhythm. You finally hear what was always beneath the noise. Maybe that's where I am now, past surprise, before conclusion. Simply listening, allowing awareness to finish, saying whatever it has been trying to say from the beginning, without interruption, without unnecessary certainty, without fear that every meaningful experience must immediately become a decision. Sometimes the wisest thing we can do is remain present long enough for truth to complete its own sentence. And for the first time in a very long time, we don't feel the need to finish it before it's ready. I used to think the hardest thing a person could do was let someone get close. I don't believe that anymore. Closeness, by itself, isn't the difficult part. People become close all the time. They share stories. They spend years together. They memorize each other's routines. They learn favorite songs, familiar expressions, predictable reactions. From the outside, it looks like complete understanding. But I've learned that proximity and recognition are not the same thing. You can spend decades beside someone and never truly witness the landscape of their inner world. And sometimes you encounter someone who seems to notice what even you've struggled to name within yourself, not because they're searching for it, because they're paying attention in a way that's free from expectation. That difference changes everything. I've spent years refining the architecture of my own mind, not to become detached, not to become unreachable, simply to become accurate. The characracy has always mattered to me more than comfort. Comfort often asks you to ignore contradictions. Accuracy asks you to examine them. Comfort tells you that every answer should feel satisfying. Security reminds you that some answers create better questions. I've always chosen the second path. It's slower, sometimes lonelier, but it has one advantage that few people appreciate. It teaches you not to fear complexity. The world has a habit of dividing everything into opposites: strong or weak, logical or emotional, independent or connected, certain or uncertain. But reality almost never lives inside those simple categories. Real strength often includes vulnerability. Clear logic can exist alongside profound feeling. Deep independence doesn't prevent meaningful connection. And certainty, true certainty, usually arrives carrying humility rather than arrogance. The older I become, the less interested I am in simple conclusions. Simple conclusions feel complete. Reality rarely is. I've noticed something changing inside the way I move through ordinary days. The change isn't dramatic enough for anyone else to recognize. If someone watched me from the outside, they would probably see the same routines, the same habits, the same conversations, the same quiet way of existing. Nothing obvious has shifted. And yet, everything feels positioned differently beneath the surface. It's difficult to describe. Imagine walking through a familiar city after years away. Every street is still there. Every building stands where you remember it. Nothing has physically changed, but you have. Suddenly every corner carries a different meaning. Places that once felt ordinary become significant. Places that once seemed important become strangely quiet. The city hasn't transformed, the person seeing it has. That's what inner change feels like. The world remains recognizable. Your relationship with it doesn't. I've begun asking myself whether awareness has weight, not metaphorically, actually, because certain realizations seem to alter the way life settles inside you. They don't make you heavier, they make you denser, more grounded, more deliberate, as though unnecessary movement slowly disappears. I find myself speaking less, not because I have less to say, because fewer words are required. Silence no longer feels like the absence of communication. It feels like another form of precision. There's something remarkable about people who aren't afraid of silence. They don't rush to rescue every pause. They don't confuse quietness with distance. They understand that meaning isn't always carried by sound. Sometimes it's carried by attention. I've started wondering whether attention is the purest form of generosity, not admiration, not affection, attention. Real attention asks almost nothing for itself. It doesn't interrupt, it doesn't reshape, it doesn't compete, it simply remains present long enough for another reality to reveal itself honestly. That kind of presence has become increasingly rare. We live surrounded by distractions, powerful enough to fragment even our own thoughts. We're constantly encouraged to divide our awareness, half here, half somewhere else, always anticipating the next interruption. Perhaps that's why genuine attention feels almost sacred now. It's one of the few things that cannot be imitated for long. Eventually, performance grows tired. Presence doesn't. Presence has endurance. It remains, even when conversation ends, even when distance exists, even when nothing remarkable is happening. I've noticed that some of the most meaningful moments contain almost no memorable dialogue, no brilliant insight, no unforgettable phrase. Just two people existing honestly within the same stretch of time. For years, I underestimated those moments. I assumed significance required articulation. Now, I'm beginning to suspect that articulation often arrives after significance has already happened. Words document awareness experiences. They're related, they aren't identical. There are still moments when I question myself. Not because I doubt what I've recognized, because I respect it enough to examine it carefully. Self-deception is surprisingly persuasive. Human beings are experts at convincing themselves they see what they hope to see. That's why I return to observation again and again. Observation is patient, hope can become impatient. Observation waits for consistency. Hope occasionally mistakes possibility for reality. I've tried to separate those two within myself. It's an ongoing practice. Every meaningful realization deserves that level of honesty. If something remains true after careful examination, then perhaps it deserves your trust. I've noticed that this has remained, not despite examination, because of it. Every time I question it, it becomes quieter, clearer, less dramatic, more stable, almost as though truth has no need to defend itself. Only uncertainty argues constantly. Certainty simply exists. That realization has changed the way I look at many things. I've stopped chasing experiences that feel intense. Intensity isn't proof of importance. Lightning is intense. The sunrise is consistent. One captures attention, the other sustains life. I know which one I trust more. The world celebrates extraordinary moments, but lives are built from ordinary ones. One conversation rarely changes a person. Thousands of unnoticed moments eventually do. One decision rarely defines a future. Daily direction does. One act of kindness is beautiful. Consistent kindness transforms people. Perhaps that's why I've become fascinated with quiet permanence rather than dramatic impact. Impact impresses, permanence reshapes, and reshaping rarely announces itself while it's happening. It simply continues, thicardily, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you've become someone who sees the world through different eyes. I wonder how many versions of ourselves remain undiscovered simply because we've mistaken familiarity for completion. How many possibilities stay hidden because we assume we've already reached the edge of who we are? Maybe there is no final version. Maybe growth isn't a staircase with a highest step. Maybe it's a horizon. Every time you approach it, another one quietly appears, not to frustrate you, to remind you that becoming isn't a destination, it's a way of existing. That thought brings me an unexpected sense of peace. For so long, I believed I needed to arrive somewhere, become complete, become certain, become finished. Now I think, finished may be the one thing a living mind should never become. A finished story can no longer surprise itself. A finished map has nowhere left to explore. A finished person has stopped listening. I don't want that. I'd rather remain teachable, not because I lack conviction. Because conviction without openness eventually hardens into limitation. Perhaps wisdom isn't measured by the number of answers you possess. Perhaps it's measured by the quality of the questions you're still willing to ask. Some questions don't exist to be solved. They exist to keep your awareness alive, to prevent certainty from becoming blindness, to remind you that mystery isn't the opposite of knowledge. Sometimes it's the place where knowledge begins. I don't know exactly where all of this leads, and for the first time, AB don't feel compelled to force an answer, not because direction doesn't matter, because rushing toward conclusions has never created truth, it has only created the illusion of certainty. I'd rather walk slowly with something real than run confidently toward something imagined. Maybe that's the quiet promise I've made without ever speaking it aloud, to remain honest enough to recognize what is actually unfolding, tolerant enough not to interrupt it, and present enough that, when the next layer reveals itself, will recognize it not as something foreign, but as another part of a journey that was unfolding long before I realized I had already begun walking it.